The room stopped breathing the moment Chloe Marino's hand closed around Antonio Ferraro's collar, yet her dark eyes never wavered from the shocked face of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Every soldier at every table froze. Nobody moved. She just held on. That night, the boss of the Ferraro crime syndicate asked her one question she was never supposed to be able to answer, and her response rearranged the entire power structure of the city. Heat pressed against the back of Chloe Marino's neck as she moved through the immaculate, suffocating elegance of Rossonate on West Superior Street. She was a heavy-set woman, dark hair pinned up, white blouse pressed crisp against her curves, black apron tied firm at the waist, a fact that Chicago's moneyed class had spent years weaponizing against her one smirk at a time. She carried her plate of spaghetti the way she carried everything in this restaurant, with both hands, with perfect balance, and with the quiet endurance of a woman who had learned that dignity was something you maintained for yourself, because no one else in this room was going to maintain it for you. She had heard 1,000 cruel remarks at 1,000 tables. She had absorbed them, pocketed them, and kept moving, until Antonio Ferraro opened his mouth at table 12, and something inside Chloe Marino, some last carefully folded reserve of tolerance, simply ran out. Rossonate had a particular kind of silence at 6 in the evening, not the absence of sound, but the presence of performance. Crystal clinked with intention. Laughter arrived on cue. Conversations dropped to murmurs the moment a stranger passed within earshot, then resumed the instant he moved on. Chloe had worked here for 3 years, and she understood the rhythm of it the way a musician understands a difficult piece, not by the notes written down, but by everything happening in the spaces between them. She arrived an hour before her shift, the way she always did. She restocked the bread baskets, polished the water glasses a second time because the first polish was never quite good enough for this clientele, and reviewed her section, tables 7 through 14, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be thanked for it. The dining room filled around her the way water fills a space, completely, and without noticing what it displaced. That was the thing about Rossonate. Chloe moved through it, and the room simply closed behind her. She had understood early in her tenure here that her size made her decorative furniture to this crowd. The men in their Italian suits looked past her shoulder when they ordered, addressing the air slightly to her left, as though their requests might find a more aesthetically suitable recipient there. The women did something worse. They looked directly at her with a particular brand of practiced pity, the kind that made the person delivering it feel generous. Chloe had a name for it. She called it the charity glance. She had stopped flinching at it sometime in her second year. What she had gained instead was something far more valuable than their regard, because the men who looked past her shoulder also spoke freely in front of her. The booth conversations that dropped to murmurs when a colleague passed never dropped for Chloe. She was a waitress. She was heavy. She was, in the specific and ruthless social calculus of this room, negligible. And so they talked about money moving through accounts that had no legitimate explanation, about arrangements with city officials whose names appeared in the newspaper every second Tuesday, about disagreements being resolved in language that required no elaboration. Chloe listened. She remembered everything. She told no one. It was not a strategy, not at first. It was. Antonio Ferraro sat the way powerful men always sat, slightly back from the table, one arm draped over the adjacent chair, occupying space that technically belonged to no one and practically belonged entirely to him. He was lean and sharp-featured, tattoos climbing from his wrists to the collar of his jacket, dark eyes moving across the room with the slow, assessing quality of someone who had learned long ago that danger announces itself in small details before it arrives in large ones. His crew flanked him in descending order of importance, 5 men who laughed when he laughed and went quiet when he did. Chloe approached with the bread basket first, the way she always did with table 12. She set it down without ceremony, distributed the side plates, and produced her notepad. Antonio didn't look at her. He was mid-sentence, something about a shipment timeline, and his hand moved dismissively in her direction. "Give us a minute." The gesture of a man accustomed to human beings arranging themselves around his convenience. Chloe waited. The crew talked. She stood. Then the one they called Nico, second from the left, leaned back in his chair and looked her over with the slow, deliberate appraisal of someone who had decided cruelty was wit. "Ton," he said, grinning at the table. "They send us a whole extra portion before we even order." The laughter came fast and easy, the way laughter does when the audience has been conditioned to perform it. Two of the men looked away, not from discomfort, Chloe noted, but from boredom. They had heard this kind of joke before. Antonio smiled, unhurried, and finally turned his gaze toward her for the first time. "Don't mind him," he said, with the smooth, magnanimous tone of a man who believed that made it better. "He was raised in a barn. What's good tonight?" It was so precisely calibrated. The gentle correction that was also a performance, the charm that arrived hand in hand with the permission that had made the joke possible in the first place. That something in Chloe identified it with complete clarity. He hadn't stopped it. He had simply redirected it toward himself. The apology was for his own image, not for her. She set her notepad down on the table. Then she set the bread plate down beside it, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone making a decision they have already fully committed to. She was aware of the crew watching. She was aware of the dining room behind her, the other tables, the soft violin threading through the speakers. She was aware of all of it, and she moved anyway. She crossed the 2 steps between her position and Antonio's chair, reached forward, closed her hand around the front of his jacket, and pushed. The chair scraped back against the hardwood. Antonio's arm dropped from the adjacent seat. The table went absolutely silent. Chloe picked up her notepad and waited. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. That was how Chloe measured it. Not by the clock above the service bar, but by the number of times Nico blinked, which was twice, slowly, like a man whose brain had simply stopped processing new information. Then Antonio laughed. It was a short sound, contained and private, entirely unlike the performative ease he'd worn all evening. He looked down at the front of his jacket where her hand had been, then back up at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet, but the particular quality of attention a man gives to something he has catastrophically underestimated. "Out," he said. The crew moved with the trained efficiency of people who understood that particular tone of voice. Nico opened his mouth. Antonio looked at him once, and Nico closed it. Within 40 seconds, table 12 was empty. The surrounding tables had been quietly cleared by staff who read the room with professional speed, and Chloe was standing in a small, charged silence with the most dangerous man in Chicago. Antonio straightened his jacket. He did not stand. She noted that. He stayed in the chair she had pushed him back into, which meant he was either unbothered or he was being very careful about what his body communicated. She suspected the latter. "Sit down," he said. "I'm working." "You were working." He said it without heat. "Sit down." She sat, not because he told her to, but because her feet ached and she had decided the moment she touched his collar that she was past performing compliance for appearances. She folded her hands on the table and waited. He studied her the way she had seen him study the room earlier, not looking at her so much as reading her, cataloging details, assembling a picture from components. It should have felt invasive. Somehow it felt like the first honest attention anyone in this building had ever paid her. "Are you stupid?" he asked. Not cruelly. Clinically. No. Reckless. Sometimes. Afraid of me? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was afraid of what you'd do. I did it anyway." Something moved across his face, brief, unguarded, almost immediately controlled. "Why?" "Because I've been absorbing that kind of joke for 3 years, and I've run out of places to put them." She said it evenly, the way you state a fact about weather. "I'm not angry. I'm just done." Antonio was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a car moved slowly down the street, headlights sliding across the white tablecloths. The violin had stopped. "You're not going to apologize," he said. "No." He nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he reached into his jacket, produced a card, and set it on the table between them with the deliberate placement of a man making an opening move. "Then don't," he said. "Come back tomorrow." Not for the shift. She came back. Not because of the card, which she had left on the table and then retrieved from her apron pocket 3 separate times during the walk home before finally placing it on her kitchen counter where it sat through the night like a small, unresolved argument. She came back because the alternative was returning to Rossonate, tying on her apron, and resuming the invisible life she had disrupted so completely that going back now would feel less like survival and more like surrender. Antonio was already there when she arrived. No crew, no performance. He was seated at a corner table near the window with 2 espressos and the relaxed posture of a man who had not spent any portion of the previous night reconsidering his decisions. He gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat without being asked twice. He talked for 7 minutes without interruption. She timed it against the clock above the bar out of habit. What he described was not what she had expected. There was no threat wrapped in courtesy, no offer that was structurally a demand. He told her, with the flat directness of someone who found manipulation inefficient, that she possessed something his entire organization lacked. She was invisible to the rooms that mattered most. His soldiers were known. His underbosses were watched. Every man on his payroll carried the specific gravity of association. Walk into a room, and the room rearranged itself accordingly. Chloe walked into rooms, and the rooms continued as though she hadn't arrived at all. "You want me to spy for you," she said. "I want you to listen. You're already doing that." He turned his espresso cup once on its saucer. "I want you to do it with a purpose." Chloe was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the street moved at its ordinary morning pace. A delivery truck, 2 women with coffee cups, a man walking a small dog with enormous dignity. "What do I get?" she asked. "Protection. Money. A reason to walk into rooms that were never going to let you in any other way. I want the protection in writing." She watched his expression. "Not legal writing. You're kind. That can be arranged. I choose what I report and what I don't. I'm not a recorder. I'm an analyst. If I bring you something, it's because I've already decided it matters." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the brief recalibration of a man updating his assessment in real time. "Agreed. And I keep the job at Rossonate. Leaving suddenly draws attention, and I won't begin this by being careless. You've thought about this." "I thought about it between the card and the door and most of the walk home," she said. "Yes." Antonio picked up his espresso. The corner of his mouth moved in something adjacent to a smile. Not warm exactly, but genuine, which she was already learning was rarer. "Welcome to the organization, Chloe," he said. The education began the following Thursday in a private room above a dry-cleaning business on North Halstead that smelled of steam and old paper and the specific kind of quiet that exists in places designed to be forgotten. Antonio spread a city map across the table, not digital, paper, the kind you could mark and fold and burn, and talk for 2 hours. He talked about territory and tribute, about which aldermen were purchased and which were merely rented, about the 3 families whose cooperation held the city's criminal architecture upright, and the precise tensions that made that cooperation unstable. He talked the way a man talks when he has decided to trust someone and is watching carefully to see whether the trust was warranted. Chloe took no notes. She never took notes. She listened with the same focused stillness she brought to table service, the kind of attention that looks passive from the outside and is anything but. On the second Thursday, she corrected him. Not aggressively. She waited until he had finished a point about the Marconi family's distribution network, then said quietly that based on conversations she had absorbed over the previous 18 months at Rossonate, the Eastern Corridor he believed the Marconis controlled had quietly changed hands sometime last spring. She gave him 3 specific conversations, the dates she estimated them, the names she'd heard attached to the arrangement. Antonio was still for a moment. Then he made a call. The call confirmed it. He looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not recalibration this time, but something closer to respect, which in his particular emotional vocabulary appeared to manifest as prolonged silence. After that, the Thursdays changed. They became exchanges rather than lectures. What Chloe hadn't anticipated was Marco Vitali. Antonio's consigliere was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who wore his suits the way certain people wore opinions, immovably, as though alternatives had never genuinely presented themselves. He had been at Antonio's right hand for 11 years. He had survived 3 regime changes, 2 federal investigations, and 1 very unfortunate situation in Milwaukee that no one discussed directly. He was, by every measure available to her, exceptionally good at his position. He was also, she noticed, exceptionally attentive to hers. The first time she caught him watching her it was at Rossonate, 3 tables away, his gaze tracking her movement through the room with an assessment that had nothing to do with the food. She filed it away. The second time was outside the dry-cleaning building as she left, a black car idling half a block further than it needed to. She filed that away too. Marco said nothing to her directly. He was too careful for directness. But she recognized the attention for what it was, not curiosity, not attraction, not casual observation. It was the look of a man beginning to calculate the cost of a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet. The dress arrived on a Tuesday inside a garment bag that took up most of her apartment hallway. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She had learned that Antonio communicated logistics through action and reserved words for things that actually required them. She unzipped the bag and stood with it for a moment. It was the color of deep emerald, floor-length, structured at the shoulders and generous everywhere else. Not in the apologetic, minimizing way that most formal wear approached a body like hers, all strategic draping and optical deflection, but with the specific confidence of a garment that had been designed to be looked at. There was no camouflage in it, no concession. It fit, she discovered when she tried it on, with a precision that meant someone had paid attention to her actual measurements rather than approximating a size and hoping. She wore it to the Ferraro Foundation's annual dinner at the Langham Hotel on Friday, and walked in beside Antonio with the careful, upright posture of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be seen, she was going to be seen completely. The room's reaction moved in a wave, heads turning, conversations briefly losing their thread, eyes tracking from Antonio to the woman beside him and finding no ready category for what they encountered. She was not the kind of woman these rooms expected to see at Antonio Ferraro's side. She was aware of this. She kept walking. Antonio said nothing about the dress or the entrance or the wave of attention. He introduced her by name to 3 people and by implication to everyone else, and his manner throughout carried the particular message of a man who found the question of why she was there entirely uninteresting. She collected 4 separate pieces of useful information before the dessert course. Marco Vitali arrived late and found her immediately with his eyes across the room in the way she was becoming familiar with, that quiet, calculating surveillance that never quite resolved into action. She watched him make his way to a cluster of men near the bar, watched him lean in with the relaxed posture of casual conversation, and watched 2 of those men glance in her direction within 30 seconds. She noted the names. Both were mid-level associates whose primary value to Marco would be as conduits, men who talked to other men, who moved information through the organization the way water moves through old pipes, constantly and mostly unnoticed. The story reached Antonio's ear 4 days later through a third party. Chloe was a federal contact. Not confirmed, not documented, simply suggested, the kind of rumor that arrives without fingerprints and spreads by the specific anxiety it produces. Antonio told her about it in the dry cleaning room with the same tone he used to discuss weather. "I know," she said. He waited. It was Marco, and he'll do it again with something slightly more specific next time. She folded her hands on the table. Let him. We're not finished setting the trap yet. Antonio's estate sat behind iron gates on the North Shore with the quiet, immovable confidence of a building that had never needed to announce itself. Chloe had been inside it 6 times now. She knew which hallways echoed and which didn't, which rooms the staff avoided after 9 in the evening, and that the dining room's north wall carried sound from the adjacent sitting room with a clarity that its architect almost certainly had not intended. She knew this because she listened to buildings the same way she listened to people, patiently, without agenda, waiting for them to reveal their structure. The private dinner was for 8. Antonio had told her that morning, with characteristic economy of explanation, that he needed her present in a service capacity, not as his associate, not at the table, but moving through the room with a wine bottle the way she had moved through Rosso Nate for 3 years. Invisible, in other words. She understood immediately why. She dressed accordingly. Dark, unremarkable, hair down rather than pinned. She arrived with the catering staff and became, to every eye in that dining room, part of the room's architecture. Marco arrived with 2 men she recognized from the Langham, the conduits, and a third she had not seen before, introduced only as Caruso, who had the careful, watchful quality of someone operating at the outer edge of his comfort zone. A city councilman named Brandt completed the party, pink-faced and overdressed, sweating gently through his dinner jacket in the way of men who have committed to something they haven't fully thought through. Chloe moved through the dinner with a wine bottle and the absolute stillness of a woman who has made herself into furniture before and knows exactly how it is done. She refilled glasses at intervals precise enough to seem attentive, but not so frequent as to intrude on conversation. She looked at the middle distance. She breathed slowly. She heard everything. The timeline emerged between the appetizer and the main course, delivered in the half-coded language of men who believed they were being careful. 3 weeks. The Ferraro shipment through the Pilsen warehouse, the one Antonio believed was known only to his inner four, would be met. The inside man was referred to only as the accountant, which was either a title or a name, and from the way Brant nodded when it was mentioned, she understood it was someone adjacent to the city's financial infrastructure. Someone with access to movement schedules. The location for Antonio himself was discussed over dessert, a meeting he was scheduled to attend on the 14th, a restaurant on West Randolph. An ambush framed as a negotiation. Chloe refilled Marco's glass at the precise moment he said the street name. Her hand was perfectly steady. He didn't look at her. Of course he didn't. She was just the waitress. She set the bottle down gently and moved back toward the kitchen. And in her mind, she was already composing every word she needed to say to Antonio before the night was out. She couldn't call him. She had understood that from the moment she set the wine bottle down. Every phone Antonio carried was known to Marco's network, and a call placed within hours of the dinner would arrive as a timestamp, a data point, a thread that led directly back to the woman refilling glasses in the north dining room. She couldn't go to the estate. Same reasoning, shorter version. She walked home through the cold with her hands in her pockets and the information arranged in her mind like a set of objects she was responsible for delivering intact, and she thought about the problem the way she thought about a difficult section of floor service. Not emotionally, but architecturally. What was the shape of it? Where were the pressure points? What broke if she moved too quickly? And what broke if she didn't move at all? By the time she reached her building, she had a plan. It wasn't elegant. It was, however, invisible. She was at Rossonate by 10 the following morning under the premise of covering an early prep shift, which required no explanation because she had covered early prep shifts before, and people do not question the behavior of someone they have already categorized as predictable. She told the kitchen manager she needed to adjust next week's scheduling preferences and use the restaurant's landline. Unremarkable, unmonitored, connected to nothing. To call a number Antonio had given her in the first week for situations that required exactly this kind of distance. It rang 4 times. A man she didn't know answered. "I need a lunch reservation," she said. "Today? 1 o'clock. The usual table." A pause. "Confirmed," the man said, and ended the call. Antonio arrived at 12:58 and ordered without looking at the menu. Chloe served his table herself. Her section, entirely natural, requiring no choreography whatsoever, and when she set down his bread plate, she slid a folded service napkin beneath it with the unhurried motion of someone adjusting a place setting. On the napkin, in her small, precise handwriting, the date, the location, the warehouse detail, and the word accountant with a question mark and Brant's name beside it. She did not linger. She moved to the next table, took an order for 2 linguine and a bottle of the house red, and returned to the service rhythm of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Antonio left 40 minutes later. He had eaten his entire meal, tipped precisely, and said nothing to her beyond his order. As he stood to leave, he buttoned his jacket and paused at the door in the manner of a man remembering something minor, except that his eyes found hers across the room for exactly 2 seconds, direct and steady, carrying the specific weight of acknowledgement between people who have learned to speak without language. Then he walked out into the afternoon, and Chloe picked up her tray and kept moving, because the floor still needed working and the information had landed exactly where it needed to go. She didn't ask what happened on West Randolph on the 14th. She didn't ask about the warehouse, or Caruso, or the councilman Brant, who stopped appearing in the city news sometime around the 3rd week of the month. She didn't ask about Marco. In the world Chloe had entered, outcomes announced themselves through absence, a name that stopped being spoken, a chair that stayed empty at a table where it had always been filled, and she had learned to read those silences the way she read rooms. Completely, and without requiring confirmation. What she knew was this. On the 15th, Antonio called and told her to come to the estate at 7. Not the dry cleaning room. Not Rossonate. The estate, which meant something had concluded and something else was beginning. She wore the emerald dress, not because she had been told to, but because she understood instinctively that whatever this evening was, it required her to arrive at full volume. She pinned her hair up, put on the only pair of heels she owned that didn't punish her for it, and walked through the estate's iron gates with the posture of a woman who had decided some weeks ago that she was finished making herself small for the comfort of rooms that had never offered her the same courtesy. The dining room held 20 men. She recognized most of them: soldiers, underbosses, associates. The layered geography of the Ferraro organization assembled with the specific formality of an occasion. She recognized also, near the back, 3 men from table 12. Nico was among them. He looked at the floor when she entered. Antonio stood at the head of the table. He watched her cross the room with the same quality of attention he had turned on her that first night after the chairs scraped back. Reading, cataloging, assembling. Except that now she understood what he found when he looked. Not a problem, not a variable, not an anomaly requiring management. An asset, his most valuable one. He said very little. That was consistent with everything she knew of him. He was not a man who used ceremony where action was sufficient. He reached to his right, where the chair at the head of the table sat at a slight angle from its position, and he pulled it out. Not his chair, the one beside it, the one that had always been empty. The one no one at this table had ever occupied because proximity to power at that particular distance required a specific kind of trust that Antonio Ferraro had not, in 11 years of running this organization, extended to anyone. He looked at her and waited. Chloe walked to the head of the table, the emerald dress catching the light with the unhurried confidence of something that had always belonged in this room, and she sat down. The 20 men adjusted. Posture, attention, the invisible architecture of deference, the way a room adjusts when it finally understands where the gravity is. Nobody laughed. If you love this dark, satisfying mafia romance and want more intense stories where the underdog takes over the empire, smash that like button, share this video with your best friend, and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were Chloe?